So where to begin? So where are we at the moment? At the moment, we're standing outside the shop of the publisher, Nishimuraya Yohachi. We're in the busy downtown district of Nihonbashi, in the city of Edo, now better known as Tokyo. By the mid-18th century, Edo had more than 1 million inhabitants. It was probably the most populous city in the world. It's larger than Paris, it's larger than London. But what makes this all the more remarkable is that in 1590, Edo was little more than a crumbling fort and a minor sleepy settlement. In the 16th century, Japan was in the grip of huge power struggles. This is known as the Sengoku period, the age of the country at war. Regional warlords and their retinues were battling for control, and there was a succession of 3 warlords, the great unifiers. The third and final of these was Tokugawa Ieyasu. He emerges as a very powerful warlord at the end of the 16th century. He's handed control of 8 provinces of Japan's Kanto region in the east. Now, relative to Kyoto, Kanto is very eastern and very remote. And Tokugawa Ieyasu chooses the sleepy fort as his new power base, Edo. In the subsequent years, Tokugawa Ieyasu emerged as the victor in these struggles. He had a huge victory at the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, and in 1603, the Japanese emperor appointed him shogun. Edo then becomes the capital for Japan's de facto rulers. So we still have the emperor in Kyoto, but he has very little political power in this period. All of the power is being concentrated in the Tokugawa shoguns, and they are concentrated in Edo. And in fact, with this shop here at Nihonbashi, Nihonbashi is the center of Japan at this point. It's mile zero. All distances across Japan are measured from Nihonbashi. And then the Tokugawa period starts around 1603 with Tokugawa Ieyasu being appointed shogun and lasts until 1868. And what really defines it compared to the period that went before is that the Tokugawa period is a period of relative peace. Peace, a lot of order, a lot of control, but the peace allows for flourishing culture, flourishing trade. The Tokugawa shogunate are very much about improving those, or sort of preventing those regional factions from emerging. So they build roads, they build networks, and these networks support the development of a very strong, flourishing, trading, mercantile culture. And Edo grew steadily through the 17th century. It started as a castle town, it rapidly became a city. By the time of this print, what we have is a vast, bustling metropolis. And it grew so quickly partly because the Tokugawa shogunate forced the regional lords and their retinues to spend every other year or so in Edo, in the shogun's lap, as it was often known. And at first, much of what they needed was brought up from the more established cities, Kyoto, Osaka. But increasingly, craftspeople, traders came in from the surrounding provinces. And that's how by the mid-18th century, we have this huge population, more than 1 million people. And the population is about half samurai class and half townspeople, the chonin, artisans and merchants. As a place to start, with this print, we've chosen a pretty auspicious time. The title of the album this print is taken from is Colours of the Triple Dawn. And a triple dawn is a new year, a new month, and a new day, the first day of the new year. And what we have in this print is the first selling at the print shop in the new year. For his own part, the publisher Nishimuraya Yohachi is looking forward to his first sales very much. You can see stacks of prints for sale here in the back of the shop, a servant readying to take away another box of prints for distribution, and a customer picking up one of his bestsellers. This is actually likely to be a print from the series Models for Fashion, New Year Designs Fresh as Young Leaves, which was also designed by Kiyonaga, the artist who designed this print. Now, Nishimuraya Yohachi was indeed a very successful publisher. If you see the trademark on the back of the curtain here, let's try to use this. It's there. This triple swirl under mountain is Nishimuraya Yohachi's trademark. And you can find this on many prints through the Edo period. For example, you'll find it on prints of famous actors, together with the Eijudo seal, Eijudo being the name of the company that Nishimuraya Yohachi had. You'll find it on elegant illustrations of refined beauties. And you'll find it on popular prints for good luck, on this little treasure ships. This is the 7 gods of good fortune in their treasure boat. It's one of my absolute favorites. And I love this so much because it's a print that you're meant to put under your pillow, so you can have lucky dreams at New Year. And on the back of the boat, there's even a little monster who is there to basically make sure you don't have any nightmares, because he will eat your nightmares. So that's a very useful print to know about. And you'll also find Nishimura Yohachi's mark on famous sites in the city. So this is an image of the crowds gathering at Kameido Plum Garden, a site later immortalized by Hiroshige as well, and they're there to see the first plum blossoms. And you'll find it on places further afield. So here we have Nishimura Yohachi's mark. You can just see there on the backpack of the traveller who's there gazing up at Kirifuri waterfall. So as you can see, although publishers and artists also sometimes had specialities, they often worked across different genres. And Hokusai also worked across many different genres. So both publishers and artists were incredibly flexible, incredibly responsive to the markets that they were working for. Hokusai in particular had an especially long career. So he's known for his beauties, he's known for his warriors, he's known for his surimono prints, as well as the landscapes. And Nishimura, as well as producing these single sheet prints, was also very active in book publishing, and he's the publisher for Hokusai's 100 Views of Mount Fuji. Now, with this print dating from around 1833 and the earlier treasure ship dating from the 1770s, you may think that Nishimura was exceptionally long-lived, or perhaps a child prodigy of the publishing world. But in fact, the name was handed down as long as the business prospered. So there are several generations of Nishimura Yohachi, but it is also a name, a personal name. And while I've drawn a lot of attention here to this publisher, this is just one example. So in the interest of balance, I should say that other publishers are also available. Based on the analysis of marks that scholars have undertaken, the number of print publishers in Edo doubled in the 1790s from around 50 to 100. By the 1840s, 1850s, there were around 250 publishers of prints active in Edo. And these numbers are even higher if you include publishers who publish predominantly books. It's a very competitive arena, and they're always looking for one way or another to edge out the competition. Now, the publisher and the artist are both often identified on prints. We often get the artist's signature and the publisher's seal or mark. And it's safe to say that obviously an artist's name would have a certain cachet among buyers, but it's really these censorship laws introduced in 1722 state that both artist and publisher names have to be included on legally published prints. And this was partly so that they could be held responsible if the prints they had made were somehow contravening the rules. So why start with the publisher rather than starting with the artist? Now, I do not in any way want to deny the aesthetic or technical qualities of these prints, or indeed the agency of the artists in creating these incredible artworks, but it's very important to underscore the commercial nature of these prints. It's really critical to their very being. And often the publisher, in the case of Japan's woodblock prints, is the one who would initiate, finance, and control the process. The publisher assembles a team of writers, artists, block cutters, and printers needed for each project. He's the one who will work with the censors and guilds, navigate the lead-in times, determine whether there's possibly scope to sell a luxury version with shimmering mica or blind printing, and perhaps even market and distribute the finished product sometimes, as here, from their own shop. So they really are quite a critical individual. And the typical starting point for a woodblock print, where there's no particular patron or commissioning client, is that the publisher themselves will commission the artist to come up with a sketch. So the artist will create a sketch, and here we have one in the collections by the artist Tori Kiyonaga. The amount of detail in one of these preparatory sketches, which are known in Japanese as shitae, the detail can really vary. So sometimes it can be a very, very rough sketch, sometimes it can be quite detailed, but it's really just an outline sketch, no colour, just a quick preparatory sketch. And for colour prints, this preparatory sketch would be the basis for the black outline, what we know as the key block print. And there's a real importance in prints of the floating world for this dynamic line, this very amazing fluid brushwork. And this sketch is by Tori Kiyonaga, and he's actually the same artist who depicted Nishimura's shop just now. So to visualize the process a little bit, I've just done this little mock-up here. The completed sketch that the artist makes would then be copied onto a very thin paper. And this is what we call the block-ready drawing. The block-ready drawing would have more of these details added into it. And this is known in Japanese as the hanshitae. Unlike the preparatory sketch, the block-ready drawing is completely destroyed in the process of cutting a block. It's pasted face down onto the woodblock, and the back of the paper is rubbed away, and oil is applied until the image can be seen through the back of the sheet. Then the block cutter, usually a master block cutter, will start cutting the image with knives and gouges, taking away all the bits of paper that sort of don't need to be printed and leaving only the black outlines. When a print is then pulled from the completed block, the print will be in the same orientation as the artist's original sketch. In this case, we can actually compare Kiyanaga's sketch with the finished print, and this is an example of this print in the Art Institute of Chicago. Kiyanaga's original sketch does include the actors' crests. I can just show you a couple of those here. So just around here we have actors' crests, and then just around here. But he doesn't include all of the details of patterns. He also doesn't include the signature. So here we have the signature and seal, and here we have some additional patterns included in the black outline that aren't included in Kiyanaga's sketch. If we can continue to compare these two images, we can find something quite interesting. If you look very closely indeed at this little corner of the crouching actor, you can see this odd little detail. And this is the kind of thing that makes me very excited indeed, because this is someone's mistake, someone's past effort. And it's really this sort of humanity of artworks that makes them much more real. So what we have here on this sleeve is a nose and an eye upside down. And I hope you can all see that well enough. What made me then even more entertained was if you turn the paper around by 180 degrees with the wonders of digital technology, you can see that just in this place, Kiyanaga has drawn the nose and mouth of the actor Nakayama Kojiro. So we can imagine exactly what happened this day in Kiyanaga's studio. He started making his sketch, he drew just an eye and a nose, and already something wasn't right. So he spins the paper around and starts again. And it's really a commendable use of materials and making sure nothing goes to waste. So once we have the block that's been cut by the block cutter, we then need to print it. And in Japanese printmaking, all these roles are divided. So you have the publisher, you have the artist, you have the block cutter, you have the printer, all very separate roles, very separate specialisms, and all requiring really a great amount of skill. So we have this wood block here in the Chester Beatty collection, and it's a block for a printed book painting manual called Technique of Cursive Brushwork, or Onpitsu Soga. And this book was published in Osaka in 1749. Now, apologies for the photograph of the woodblock. They're not the easiest things to photograph, and this is my own image, but hopefully you can see the page that has been printed from it when comparing it to the block. Now, in Japanese woodblock printing, there's no printing press used. So the carved block is set down in front of the printer, and he will then apply rice paste and ink to the block, then lays a sheet of paper on top of the block and applies pressure to the back of the paper. And he does this using something called a baran, which is a round printing pad made of lacquer and bamboo leaf cord. And this allows him to apply very even pressure across the back of the sheet of paper, allowing the ink to transfer from the block. Now, if you notice here, this is just something particular to printing for a printed book. The block doesn't relate to a single opening. So typically in Japanese woodblock printing, you're printing only on one side of the sheet. And there are some different printing styles in use for printed books, but this is one of the most common. This is fukuro toji, the bag-bound book. And in this case, the printed sheet of paper, so you take your print from the block, is folded in half. It's folded back on itself, printed side out. So in that way, one sheet printed from a block creates effectively the front and back of a page. So if you see here on this side, you have the text that becomes the recto of the page, the front of the page, and here we have the bird, and that becomes the verso. So the single sheet of paper folded back on itself. And you've got this very characteristic broad central gutter down the page, which is very characteristic of the bag-bound books. So once you've printed and folded your sheet, you then stack the folded sheets together, and the open ends are put here. So the open ends are then stab bound to make the book. and the covers are finally sewed on. And what you can also see, if you look at the printing block very closely, is this line here. And this is the title of the book above and the page number here. And that becomes visible, just visible, on the outer edge of the book as you leaf through, which is very useful for us as we're working through these books. So Unpitsu Soga, as I mentioned, this Techniques of Cursive Brushwork was published in Osaka, and it has an Edo distributor listed among its publishing credits. And it's very important to know that Japan's print industry did not originate in Edo. In fact, Japan's first printed illustrated secular book, this one, the Saga Bon Tales of Ise from 1608, was printed in Kyoto. The first commercial book publishers were also located in Kyoto in around the 1620s. Kyoto was really a key cultural centre, and at this time Edo was really just a castle town. In the 1670s we had a growth of publishing industry in Osaka, another major city in Japan, a very mercantile city. And in the 18th century, that's when we see the really significant growth of publishing in Edo. And this is partly because as the city developed, its patterns of cultural consumption changed. At the beginning, it was very much seen as sort of a receiver of culture from Kamigata, the area of Kyoto and Osaka, much more established areas with much longer established sort of cultural production, traders, artisans. But as the city developed, as Edo grew, it became a cultural centre in its own right and a producer of its own culture. And what we have is literature, theatre, fashion and arts increasingly showing a very local flavour. In fact, it borders on Edo-centrism a lot of the time. They're very self-referencing, very playful, and it's all very focused on sort of defining Edo. So we find prints that capture the sights of the city. So here we have a very elegantly dressed patron strolling through the great gate of the Yoshiwara. The Yoshiwara is Edo's very famous licensed prostitution district. And this is one of a series of prints that sort of shows the journey up to this moated district and all the beautiful women who could be found there. And if you note also in this image, we have some buckets of water just here at the back. This is sadly because the light wooden architecture of Edo was also very fire prone, and fires were really known as the flowers of Edo. So it's just a little reminder of the sort of wider context going on. We also find early monochrome prints of actors. So here we have a group of actors in a theatre scene, and this theatre scene is probably set in Shinobazu. So Shinobazu is this very famous pond in Tokyo. You can still go there now. It's just by the Ueno Museum district, and it has these beautiful lotus flowers. So this is probably a scene set around Shinobazu Pond. And the cross-shaped crests that we can see on the fish seller here tell us that this is the actor Otani Hiroji I. And Otani Hiroji was known as one of Edo's big four actors. He really had considerable success for playing leading roles, and he actually then toured two theatres in Kyoto and Osaka. So what we already see here is a real celebration of Edo in print. These aren't mute places. What we have are fashions, celebrities, ways of being in the world, a real celebration of what it is to be Edo. And this is just one aspect in a huge diverse print culture. So the prints and printed books that are preserved in art museums are just the tip of the iceberg. We have programs, critiques, witty fiction, votive slips, anthologies, toy prints, ads, calendars and news sheets, all competing for people's attentions in a really graphic visual society. And these are all the ephemera of a really thriving culture. And that is just the beginning. So the constant competition and innovation between publishers led to new ways to sell. So from the 17th century, monochrome prints were enlivened with hand-applied colour. And this particular one here on the left, this is called an urushie, and we see these from the early 18th century. The black ink is mixed with something called nikawa, an animal glue, and this gives it a really glossy sheen. And that's what's used here for the woman's raincoat. There. But obviously hand applying colour to each individual print is very time consuming, and that makes it costly. So around the mid 18th century, in the 1740s, we start to see these prints that are known as benizuri-e. And benizuri-e are early colour prints. They're usually beginning with two or more printed colours. So at the beginning, we usually see this kind of palette, black key block impression with additional green and rose pink colours printed on top. And the number of printing blocks gradually increased, and also the colours could be overlapped, but it's really quite a limited use of colour within the print. And then something else happens, and in the mid-1760s we start to see these really richly coloured prints, and these are called nishiki-e, brocade pictures. And the nishiki-e technique is really saturating the whole of the printed sheet with colour. It's first seen on privately commissioned prints, so not things made for commercial sale, but things made at a particular request of a patron who was putting up the money to do so. But from 1765, we see their commercial application and popularization. And this is really spearheaded by an artist called Suzuki Harunobu, who's someone who we'll be talking a bit more about next week. And you really have to have the best materials to do this, because the paper has to withstand being printed on several times to get these layers of colors all brought together. And this is really what Edo brought to the table, this really glorious, vibrant color prints. So the move to colour printing from hand colouring was made possible with a very simple innovation that was very, very effective. And these are the registration marks, or kento, that are really sort of one of the features of Japanese woodblock printing. So these registration marks were added to the key block, the block used for printing the black outline initially. And what we have is a small mark in the corner, an L-shaped mark, this is called the kagi kento, and then one on the long edge, a rectangular stop called the hikitsuke. And there's some disagreement over exactly when these registration marks were introduced. And this is largely because the historical sources that we have disagree. So one source says that they were brought in around 1765 when we see these full colour prints, but another says that that's completely wrong. They were there in 1744. So they were there for the Benizurie, the limited colour prints, the early colour prints. So this is the real technological development. But then there's other things that also help. So the paper, new papers allowed sort of more luxurious printing. And the way the registration works with these marks is that the marks are first of all added to the key block, the block used for the black outline print. And then the way you make all the color blocks for making a color print is you take prints from the key block, but you include these little marks. You include your mark here and your mark here. And then when you carve the block, say for the red, you include these marks again, these little stops on the block. Then when the printer is printing, he can set the paper down using these guides. And it just ensures that each time he sets the paper down, he sets it down in exactly the right place, in exactly the right place relative to the other colors. And that's what allows the colors to register so accurately. And it still takes an awful lot of skill. Now, Japan, for anyone who's been there, will know it's a very humid country. If you're printing with wooden blocks and paper, humidity is a big issue. You have to think about which months you're printing in, how humid it'll be. And you might even have to make little adjustments to the positioning of these registration marks. If the block warps at all, then you would take a little piece out, add a little piece in. So there's always this very careful sort of craft to the making of woodblock prints, even with these technological developments enabling the process to become that much more complex. And this registration process is the basis for all the incredible artworks that follow. And this is from Utamare's exquisitely attired beauties to the saturated landscapes seen through the works of Hiroshige and other artists. The palette and the colorants change over time. There's always new developments, there's always new things publishers are willing to try out, but the fundamental technology stays the same. Layer upon layer of color building up really beautiful images. So if we go back to the 1760s and try to imagine what this sort of flooding with colour was like, I think the most helpful comparison I can think of is how colour came in movies. So if you imagine Dorothy, Judy Garland, stepping from her sepia world into the glorious Technicolor of Oz, that's what it feels like to me, that we have this sort of this incredible new world opening up, a new richness and new vitality to the world of print. And as a witty novel of the time comments, by this stage, the monochrome prints are completely old-fashioned. What the people want is the novelty, the richness of full colour. As it says, the black and white prints of earlier days are antiquated now, and the only thing people care for is the newly devised gorgeousness of the Edo brocade pictures. Now, these prints were known at the beginning as Azuma Nishiki-e. Nishiki-e, as I mentioned, is brocade pictures. So Nishiki, brocade, is a sort of very rich textile. So it's saying that the prints are rich like textiles. Azuma means Eastern, and this is sort of a poetic name for Edo. It's seen in the Tales of Issei and other literature, and it's Edo as the Eastern city. So these are also sometimes known as Edo pictures, and it shows just how much the full colour prints were an esteemed and eponymous product of the city of Edo. And that's where sort of the exhibition title came from, Edo in colour, the colours that make up the world, the vibrancy of a city set on paper. So who was buying these prints? There's actually, very sadly, very little concrete data on print economics, the costs, the production runs, the sales. Largely what we're going on is very anecdotal evidence, often included within these sort of witty novels of the period. But what is fairly comfortably known is that they were relatively affordable. So in 1842, there's a government edict that caps the price of a print at 16 mon. And 16 mon is the price of a bowl of soba noodles, the so-called nihachi soba, or 2x8 noodles. In a book from 1805, that mentions 20 mon for a single sheet print. So while the prices are changing and there's various forces at play, they are something that would be relatively affordable to people of different classes and backgrounds. And some prints were also sold in different editions. So obviously, if you have the deluxe version with glittery printing, with blind printing, embossing, then that would sell for more, but there might be a cheaper version available as well. Others, which were more working as sort of adverts, would offset the costs of printing with sponsorship. So there really is a range of things going on. Again, how many were produced? This is very difficult to say, obviously with fires and earthquakes, and not to mention the ravages of a humid climate. From what survives, we can't really know how many were made. What is understood is that orders for prints were placed in batches of 200. If a publisher was uncertain of the subject, it's a little bit tricky, the artist was maybe untested, didn't have a good name, then maybe they'd only order 400 prints to start with. But a popular print might be printed and reprinted again and again by the thousands. And one of the most popular areas of prints was always actors. And with their legions of fans, celebrated actors would definitely command significant sales. And here we have two of the most famous, the top billing actor Ichikawa Danjuro V, there on the right, and the leading baddie of the Edo stage, Nakamura Nakazo I. And it's unsurprising really that several artists specialized in actor prints because these were always good sellers. But even then, there was this huge pressure to be the first to capitalize on an upcoming performance, spot the new talent coming to the stage. And there were really close contacts between the theatre and the publishing worlds. The market for prints also reached far beyond Edo. So as well as the prints of landscapes and famous places, which could function like souvenirs, we have others with celebrity status. So here we have a really commanding print of two sumo wrestlers, Tanikaze and Onogawa, and they were the champions of their time. And this print is by a leading Edo artist, but it's been published in Nagasaki, right at the other end of the country, down in Kyushu. And sometimes the prints themselves can provide evidence of their own popularity. So the series Models for Fashion, New Year Designs Fresh as Young Leaves, while its title may not be the shortest and catchiest, was really a huge seller of its day. And each of the prints in this series shows the trend-setting ladies of the prostitution district. Their fashions and hairstyles were really kept up to date. So up to date that if a print was issued and then it was reissued, you might find that they have a different hairstyle by the time it's reissued. The importance was keeping them really at the peak of fashion. And sometimes names might also be changed with reissues. And this just shows not only the fast-moving fashion, but also the popularity of the print, that it's running into these new issues, new editions. And these prints were timed to go on sale with the Yoshiwara Saiken, a series of guidebooks made to the prostitution district. The other thing that tells us how popular it was is that the first prints were issued in 1776, designed by the artist Koryusai, whose work you see here. And Koryusai designed at least 110 prints for this series, which was then continued by Tori Kiyonaga. And if you remember the print back at the beginning of Nishimura Yohachi's shop, you'll remember the customer was looking at a lovely print. And it's quite likely that the print he was looking at here was one from Models for Fashion, New Year Designs, possibly designed by Tori Kiyonaga. So we have a little bit of product placement going on within prints. And another series where we can clearly see the popularity it had is Hokusai's 36 Views of Mount Fuji, which, despite the name, features 46 prints. So originally 36 prints were planned, the series proved so popular, they just extended it and did another 10 prints in the series. But this could work the other way too. So Hokusai designed this incredible series, 100 Poems as Told by the Nurse, and this was never fully realized in print. In fact, we have a lot of sketches showing Hokusai's designs for prints that were never realized, but some were. So the anecdotal evidence that we have from Edo, while we can't be concrete about who was buying, how much they were paying, or distribution, the circulation, what we see really through the anecdotal evidence in visual and in literary culture is this really wide consumption of prints across ages, across genders, and across status. And the artists and the publishers both had to work really hard to read this audience, to anticipate their wants and desires, and not just to stay abreast of, but also to shape the fads and fashions that would sweep through the city. And it all really comes full circle. So here in this lovely print of Shinmei Shrine in Shiba, if you look just to the right above the umbrella, I'll show you here now, you can see a little group of prints for sale. So we have here probably an actor print, and here what looks like a sumo wrestler. There were actually sumo wrestling matches held at Shinmei Shrine, so that would be quite appropriate. And these prints were really part of the culture of the city, part of the fabric of the city. The Metropolis of Edo gave prints an audience, gave them a market, but it also gave them a subject. And it's this relationship between the two that I'm really fascinated by. So the exhibition that we'll be showing you next year is not claiming to show everything. There are entire genres that you really won't see: warriors, birds and flower prints. And we'll only touch lightly on how prints circulated beyond Edo. And the same for the prints that were created outside Edo, the Osaka prints, the Nagasaki prints. It's just one part of this much wider print culture that we can look at in the space of one exhibition. But what I really want to do is focus on this split question. What are Edo's publishers and printmakers creating, and what are they selling? And for me, it's really the city itself. That Edo is not just a physical space, but an identity, and that the prints really help create that sense of what it means to be Edo. And in that way, for me, they're a starting point in a journey into a really exquisite world. And I'll finish there.